Okay.
Well, welcome everyone. We're glad you joined us, and hopefully the other people who signed up will be joining us here as well. We're glad to have our county historian, Bill Munn, here with us tonight. And this is actually a talk that Bill did for the Historical Society in Grant County last summer. So that was first part of a four-part series on Grant County and the Civil War, I believe. So in October, Bill will be doing part two at the Historical Society meeting, and then we'll hopefully have him on here after that to do part two for our Zoom audience as well. So we'll go ahead and just turn it over to Bill.
Okay. I guess my experience as a teacher has trained me to, when you've got a big topic like this, is to break it up, because there's really no possible way. I mean, in our hour together, it's we can touch on some major points. Now, since this is like the first, I have changed it since I change them all the time. Okay, so I'll do something and I'll think, no, I want to do it a different way. But in any event, um, context, and we know as students of history and as historians, context is everything. It's foundational to our understanding of the past. So if we know the conditions of life, the struggles people were having, daily life, making a living, their belief systems, their education. If we have at least some grasp of it, I think then it starts, what's going on starts to make more sense. Maybe not complete sense, but more sense. Also, I really celebrate people who are into collecting stories. And I've only recently the last few years, taken up genealogy, but I really love the stories. Now, in order to get the stories, of course, you have to have the connections and all that sort of stuff. And there's not, some of the stories are buried. Some of the stories were never collected. So there were also stories that were transmitted down that weren't true, whatever. That's okay. I mean, I just like to see the stories and hear people tell stories about these people. I grew up in Angola, Indiana, which is up in the very northeast corner. Like to say 9 miles from Michigan and 9 miles from Ohio. And this was in the 50s and 60s. And at least for folks in my grandparents' generation and my own parents, actually our whole family was in big talkers and into telling stories and tales of the farm, and again, making a living, going to the doctor. And it was I loved it. I loved hearing those stories. I loved hearing people talk. So anyways, that's a little bit about me, but let's start with our topic. In real estate, location is everything. And I think living in Grant County, or being from Grant County, or having family connected with Grant County, it's important that we understand some things about the location in East Central Indiana. And I start this really with the pioneers, of course, and the Native Americans, and also African Americans. Those three groups were present at the beginning, just different times, but they came together here and brought with them attitudes and beliefs and conflicts. And out of that came a lot of developments which we still have with us today. And it also, for example, since tonight's topic is the Civil War, those connections explain a lot about Grant County's participation in the Civil War. Uh, of course, we know that Indiana, all of Indiana, was part of the Northwest Territory. Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, and actually, our colonial founding fathers thought that the Northwest Territory and subsequently the Louisiana Purchase areas would be free of, as Jefferson said, the dead hand of the past, that this was sort of a blank slate upon which a new, not only a new nation, but a whole civilization could be built. And so we know about the surveying and the getting the, for the European settlers, it was all about possession of the land. That was wealth. Okay, and that's what most of their experiences in Europe had to do with land being taken away from them and being forced off the land. I know if you got any Scottish or Irish people in the family, or even Germans or French, the people that came here, basically, they lost it all, one way or the other. But anyways, that's sort of the vague past. But part of the organization plan put forth by the the Confederation Congress made the one of the requirements of the Northwest Territory that all of the states that were formed from the Northwest Territory had to be free states. Slavery was prohibited by law. Now, this was a radical departure from the past. And we know that the United States was a slave country. The colonies practiced slavery. Actually, most of them practiced slavery. New York didn't abolish slavery until, I believe, 1825 or 1830. I mean, it was, and Massachusetts was actually one of the larger slaveholding states in the 17th century. Okay, they sort of got away from that, but of course we're going to find out that this what they call it, the fatal flaw, I suppose, the precipitator of a lot of things in American history, the unresolved issues generated out of slavery. At one point, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson, who himself was a slave owner, said, if there is a just God, we are going to be punished for this. And he was referring to slavery. So even a number of more enlightened, I should say, sort of enlightened slave owners sort of had in the back of their head, they knew this was going to be something that was going to have serious repercussions in our history. But human beings, but being what they are, well, but not this year. Next year, no, but maybe in our kids' generation. And then there were others that were absolutely unreconstructed who said, we're not ever going to give this up. And now the folks that came here were they had experience with slavery somewhat. There were three main corridors of immigration into Indiana. One, it's easy. One from the northern colonies, one from the central colonies, and one from the southern colonies. And so Indiana really, more so than the other states of the Northwest Territory, had a real blend of all three of these groups. And if you add to it the presence of Native Americans, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Piankashaw, who were the governing powers of this inland empire. They saw themselves, it's their area. Okay. So anyways, into this came large numbers of European settlers or settlers of European descent. And a number of those people, interestingly enough, were had anti-slavery positions. So, for example, the Quakers. It seems like every time I go to talk about Grant County, you really have to talk about the Quakers because until after the Civil War, over 50%, that's an estimate, but I can see the Quakers did keep track of their own people. So we can actually project that probably around 50% of the early settlers were Quakers. And Quakers weren't necessarily from Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, by the 18th century, there were major Quaker settlements like in Nantucket off of Massachusetts. There were Quaker settlements in Virginia, and there were large Quaker settlements in North Carolina. And the Quakers had large families. They needed plenty of land to because they believed they didn't have primogeniture. They weren't in the habit of willing the whole property over to the oldest son. It was we'll split it up. So, of course, what that did, though, was it divided up the original land areas. But that was deliberate. They wanted to do that, but also that required that they somehow find new places for the next generation to live. And just so happens that in the 1830s and 40s, especially in North Carolina, the Quakers had to get out for the most part. It had to do with the fact that they had forsworn slavery. The yearly meeting, and I don't know the exact year, but it was in the early 18th century, had decided that it was impossible to be a Quaker and own slaves. They had several and owned slaves before that. And I guess some of them left the Quaker church, but most got rid of their slaves, or I mean, manumitted their slaves. Well, with the value of land increasing in those eastern colonies, and especially North Carolina, it was important that they find another place. And it just so happens that this is about the same time that Indiana had become a state in 1816, but the settlement, the land sales, really started big time from 1820 on. And so it was possible to buy significant parcels of land at a price that was too good to be true. And what happened was, and they also, by the way, were always regarded somewhat askance by their neighbors. The peaceable kingdom wasn't popular with a lot of people, and especially the refusal of the Quakers to bear arms. They had arrived, and this was an older thing, the peace testimony, which said that you can't be a member of the church and bear arms against another human being. And this immediately identified them as cranks. With the other people were armed to the teeth, and so this was not popular. Also, they would not swear oaths on a Bible, that it was considered to be presumptuous of you in terms of God. And of course, this may put all sorts of contracts and things into dispute. But in any event, they had to get out. So they did, and went across from Guilford County, North Carolina, and southern Virginia. There were some too, and even what becomes West Virginia and southern Ohio. And they came to Richmond, Indiana, worked their way up from Richmond to Newcastle and to Marion. And well, Grant County, actually. Okay, so these people came in to establish their farms and I think to get out of the fray. And as we know, the Miamis by 1850 had been largely driven out of this area. And there's a whole tale there. A tale that I know that over in the History Center they're working on about documenting what happened in regards to the Miamis. There were some who chose to remain. The reading I'm doing, so a lot of them were what were called métis. They were over the years they had married in French settlers had married into the Native American culture, so they were kind of bearing two cultures. But anyways, well, that's another story for another day. But anyways, okay, and I just mentioned a couple of names. There were many names. Actually, Grant County was a major stop on the Underground Railroad that went from Richmond, Newcastle, up to farmland in Delaware County, and then farmland in Grant County, and on to Fairmount, Marion, and on to Mount Etna, and they kind of worked their way around Fort Wayne. That was kind of a dangerous place, and went on to Michigan and then across to Canada. So free families, and it was a major what do you call a major trail, a major thoroughfare for freed men and women, or well, not freed, but people escaping slavery to find their way to freedom. A couple of names: the Baldwins, all of them. The Baldwin family were Quakers and were very much involved. Lydia Baldwin and her husband, and the Coggeshals, which I keep mentioning the Coggeshals because they're kind of like some of my favorite people. They were farmers that lived in the country, by the way, the wild country, which was like what today 38th Street is, right across from the College Church. That was Coggeshall. Now they had land at other spots too. Coggeshals came from the family came from England to Nantucket, and from Nantucket to North Carolina, and from North Carolina here to Indiana. And in Nantucket, they were whalers. Okay, they went out on the big ocean. Okay, and now the Quakers were not the only religious group, and I'm focusing on religious group because that was such a big part of the lives of most of the pioneers. It was their social life, their spiritual life, and their social life, and they had no phone, they had no Twitter, they had, and they worked a lot. Okay, anybody knows much about anything about farming in that day, even clear into their, well, it's still hard work, but it was, especially until like World War II. Anyways, the Wesleyan Methodists, all right, actively engaged with the Underground Railroad. I tease some of my Wesleyan friends. I tell them that their positions were really similar on a lot of things. Then they believed in the total equality of all human beings. That included women as well as African Americans. They had ordained some African Americans. They had ordained some women, and actually some of that I think the Quakers found hard to. Except I think they too had that equality thing, but it was the Wesleyan Methodist position was actually seen as more radical. Okay, now the Methodist, the mainline Methodist church. And it depended on the church, depended on the congregation. This was one of the reasons for the Wesleyans splitting off. I mean, the Wesleyans were looking for a more, sort of unified, we all believe this, where in the Methodist church, there was latitude between the various congregations. And the Methodists were, the fight on the frontier in the Second Great Awakening, that religious revival, was between Methodist and Presbyterian, or Methodist Presbyterians and Baptists. Okay, not so much Presbyterians, but Methodist and Baptist. And up here it was the Methodist Church. It's still well, things have changed, but so what they were essentially hearing an anti-slavery message, a message that this is not morally correct position. I do want to mention the Presbyterians. Again, Presbyterians are very important to the settling, even though, I guess in my own background, I sort of overlooked it because it has to do with the Scots-Irish. Okay. The Scots-Irish were largely Presbyterians, at least in their first coming over. They were forced. Well, we know the story about Ireland, and we know the story about Scotland and the Presbyterian Church and the battles with actually they fought everybody, but it was to maintain their own Presbyterian church. Some were supporters of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and some were engaged in constant fighting with the British and very lost most of the time. And poor people were dispossessed of their land, and it was root hog or die, as my grandma used to say. You had to go someplace else and find another life. You had to leave. You couldn't do this in Scotland, and it was important to preserve their religion. Now, if you'll recall, the Presbyterians were Calvinists. Okay, so they bore some relation to the Puritans, in New England. Now they fought too, but it was there was sort of a commonality there. And the people, I tease my sisters and say, I've done some genealogy. I'm not as good as you people are, but I'm trying. And I found the Munn people in southwestern Pennsylvania, down in Washington County. And yes, they were Presbyterians, and yes, they signed the covenant, and yes, they made whiskey, and yes, they fought the Indians, but they didn't own slaves. Now, further south, they would have, I suspect, if you were same people in West Virginia. But there was also a kind of an anti-slavery, what I would say, an anti-slavery bent, not because they were. I'd like to think it's because they were like the Quakers or the Wesleyans, like they had a view, the equality of all mankind. No, they didn't want any competition from anybody. They saw almost every group as a potential, attack, and their experience was that was true. Okay, they were anti-government. They did feel that they had a superior moral position, and by George, they were going to defend it. So, but it did create an anti-slavery, but not an ethical anti-slavery. It was just, we don't want it. Okay. A good example of that is Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's second vice president, who was kind of an unfortunate thing, but he sort of inherited that, I guess, it's sort of a paranoid view of the world. And it was his defeat. Now, also in Grant County, and there were plenty of Methodists, there was another group that was kind of smaller. Actually, it was smaller because I think they were sort of like, they didn't want to announce what they believed. And this was a group of people that were referred to as free thinkers. Okay, these were people that were sort of the last of the Enlightenment folks. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created. Now, everybody back then, okay, so that's our Declaration of Independence. Yes, of course. But if you really look at it, it's a much more radical document than most people thought it was. Okay. And so there were people, and they're more or less on their own. Could be Unitarians, for example, but they weren't formally part of any religious group, and probably did reject going to church and that kind of stuff. And I found a cool reference to, by the way, most of the stuff I'm getting, I got a lot of it from Brandt and Fuller and their 1886 history of Grant County, and there's a biographical dictionary with that, much better than Whitson. much better than Whitson. I have a lot of bones of contention with Whitson. Now I recommend that he be read, but Brandon Fuller, actually, it was a professional group that did. They made money by selling county histories, and by the way, they're both online at the Internet Archive for free. And you can go online, you can call them up on your screen, you can make them larger, you can make it smaller, which I've had to do is make things larger that I'm looking at, because of these. But it's so cool because when it's, well, we're not in Montana, but it does get cold out here, if you'll remember. And it get and so on a cold, icy day when you don't want to go outside. I do like winter too, by the way. I like looking at it through the window. and you can go online and you can access these things, which used to require a cold trip to the library, although the library is a warm place once you get there. Sometimes, most of the time. Okay, but Atkinson, who lived in Monroe Township, now you're starting to get close down there. That Jefferson, I think, is one south of there, I believe. Yeah, Upland and those places. But there was a farmland in Grant County, a crossroads village, whatever, and there was one in Delaware County, which that causes some confusion. And both were anti-slavery areas. Okay, they're both stopped up. But Charles Atkinson was he in the Brandon Fuller book, he's called the violent abolitionist of Monroe Township. Isn't that great? The violent which probably tells you he wasn't a Quaker. A violent abolitionist of Monroe Township. And he actually ran an anti-slavery store. So did Lydia Baldwin as well. What it was for those who refused to buy any products produced by slave labor. And so there was places where they could get farmed cotton rather than the slave work camps. It was done on a family farm or something. It's almost like this sort of sounds to me a little bit like the organic thing, like some people are into. Well, I am too, kind of. And so it had to be identified, though, as this was not made by slave labor. Also, a thing that I love hearing about is Lydia Baldwin, who we have some copies of her memoirs. I believe they're very, very short, but they're very interesting. She was noted for going around with gray, when their dresses, they showed it was not a slip, but that it would be below the hem of the dress. I guess it was a slip. The idea was, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Petticoat.
Petticoat, right. Well, it was a matter of pride that your petticoats had to be, absolutely pristine, which was a pretty hard thing in the 1840s and 50s. And the Quakers did a lot of walking too. It was you showed your commonness, by not riding the horse, but putting like your child or that sort of thing, or your load on the horse, and then you would walk beside with the horse. Okay, well, which meant their petticoat was nasty. Well, what they did was, do you remember bluing?
Yes.
You know about bluing?
Yes.
My grandma used to, when I was a little kid, I'd help her, with the tubs of water where she had one of those washing machines, electric washing machine, but you had to take it out and then you ran it through the wringer and then you put it in its tubs. And I think they put bluing in the washing machine with the white stuff, because it gave the illusion. Well, it was sort of like a little blue cast made the white look whiter when the sun shined on, I guess. But the problem with bluing is it was made from indigo, and indigo was a major product of South Carolina. And between rice and indigo, and indigo is a it's not edible as far as I know, but it grows in the same sort of swampy conditions that rice does. You have to the field has to flood at certain times, and you have to go out in the mud and pick it. That short of sugar cane, which they didn't do much of, that was Louisiana. It was death to slaves working those indigo fields and those rice plantations were particularly horrible. And so what they agreed to do is not to sell those products. And so she went with gray petticoats, which is sort of a badge of anti-slavery. I mean, I know it's a little background, but it's I think you're starting to see some context. Also the African American settlers at Weaver. So by 1840, I mean this was fair. Well, it was really unusual, to have in one locality. You had the Miami people, or the remnants of the Miami people who went to the woods out by Jalapa, and stayed there. No, they actually got grants through Mishinga. I mean, got some land, but it was, well, anyways. So you got Native Americans. By the way, who there are stories in the Miami local Miami culture about the Miamis participated in the Underground Railroad. They did provide shelter for African Americans. I kind of suspect that with their experience with European settlers, I think it was a kind of a soft way of getting back at some of them. But anyways, so again, it's the convergence of the different groups, but there was a lot of anti-slavery talk, a lot of anti-slavery action. Now, and in talking about the black settlers, a beautiful example of this convergence was David Wilson, no more like Davy Wilson, who was an AME preacher, one of the early AME ministers at the Weaver community. And he was ordained by, and I'll get this, by Allen, right? Is it David Allen? Not, well, it was Bishop Allen was one of the founders of the AME church, because they wouldn't let him sit upstairs, or they had to make him sit upstairs in church, in the white churches. And so the AME church was founded. And David was in an early group to be ordained. And the Weaver AME church was called the Frontier Church by the national AME group. They had bishops and dioceses, and they used that structure like the Catholic, Lutheran, and Episcopal Church. This was at that time was the furthest northern church, AME church in the United States. So, okay. Now there was a pro-slavery contingent in Grant County. They say, I told you we had everything. There were actually the pro-slavery group was concentrated down around Upland and Matthews in the very southeastern part of the county. And it had to do with, I think have you heard of New Cumberland? New Cumberland? Where they have the bridge at Matthews? The covered bridge still there, holding on for dear life. It was that was the settlement. And you know how people back then they needed to be by a river. The river was very important, even if it wasn't a big one. It still was important for the mills, to grind your products. You had to have drinking water, and I mean, for a whole lot of reasons. Well, actually, too, for making whiskey and that sort of business. But they came from Virginia through the Cumberland Gap, about the same route as the Quakers, or the African Americans as well. We have an account from one of the Weaver descendants who came as a 10-year-old with his mom and dad, Henry Weaver, who came with his mom and dad from from North Carolina. It took 2 years to come from Western North Carolina to
Oh,
Grant County. Now it was a you had to stop every so yeah. I mean, it was like you got to eat, and so they take work or do something to earn some money or trade some hides or whatever in order to get him. But the pro-slavery guys, it was the same sort of deal. Um, Virginia was a very class, and a lot of those southern states were very, there was an aristocracy, and then there were some middle class whites, like in the cities. There weren't a lot of cities though. There were some, and then there were slaves. And so, what was your place? In as a poor white person in Southern society, there wasn't one, and you weren't going to be able to buy in on. Even if you did have money, you couldn't buy in on the land deal because land was turning over, and it was wealth. Also, you couldn't afford slaves. And that was your ticket to the next level. Your ticket to the upper classes was ownership of slaves, and slaves were far too expensive. And so when they came through here, they certainly were pro-slavery. Okay. I mean, again, that was like, if I ever have some money, I'm going to go move back south. I'm going to have me some slaves, and I'm going to open up. Actually, a number of these people went out to Tennessee and Arkansas a little bit later, right? When those places were open and they were slave states. All right. I always have to laugh. The Milligan House in Huntington. I'm sure, Rhonda, you're familiar with Milligan in Huntington. There's a house they restored. And in the old handouts, they used to say, a station in the Underground Railroad in Huntington. No, it wasn't. It was a place where Milliken would host slave catchers, and they would lock them in there's his brick building or his stone building out behind his place, and he'd hand them over to the slave catchers for money. He was getting them back into slavery, and that was sort of the same thing. The Knights of the Golden Circle were agitating for slavery and against abolition. But they were a small enough group that I really don't think they posed much of a threat. There was an incident during the Civil War where they apparently got into some sort of street brawl with the Union recruiters in Jonesboro, and it was, I don't know, they just had it and it was over with, and I don't think it stopped the recruiting. Now, there's also politics, all this stuff. Of course, there's a political bit, and they were political. I mean, they were extremely political, and elections were, today we're, oh my God, elections, they've gone haywire. We've got all this, well, there was deep political instability in the first half of the 19th century that of course, see, my area is political science, besides history. And I know that when you get this political stability, in a way, kind of like we have now, it opens the door to larger conflict. All right. And Grant County, I don't want to bore you with the whole routine, but I do have the whole routine down here. I mean, there's a site called Geographic Atlas of American Elections, which is I can put some of these, I can send these to you guys at the library, then you can send them out to whoever wants it. It's great because you can zoom in on Grant County or any county in the United States for all of the elections for which returns exist, which are almost all of them. Okay, so 1844. I'll ask a question. Any guesses who Grant County voted for in 1844? Remember your presidents now. This is a softball. Seeing no takers, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison. you remember the uh, what do I want to say, the appointed governor of Indiana Territory, okay, and a Virginian who was actively engaged in driving the Native Americans out of Indiana. I mean, that was his actually, I think it was his main that's what he was focused in on. He was he's like a northern version of Andrew Jackson. Only I think Harrison came from a more moneyed crowd. I think maybe he wasn't as loud and cantankerous as Jackson, but William Henry Harrison, his house was down there in Vincennes. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to go down there. They've restored it. It's really quite nice. Harrison, I really was from technically from Ohio, or and apparently there's a place down there that's very nice. Harrison got 56% of the vote. He was a Whig, a Whig, a Whig. My kids always got a kick out of that. He was a Whig. No, and he beat Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren had been vice president under Andrew Jackson. There were a lot of differences between Harrison and Van Buren. Van Buren, by the way, I won't ask this as a question because nobody ever gets it, except my wife. She knows this, even before the only president for which English was not his native language was Martin Van Buren. He was in his teens before he learned English. His people were Dutch. The Dutch, they were New Yorkers, and they lived in upstate New York, Kinderhook. And yeah, he spoke Dutch. Actually, he probably would have been better off speaking Dutch because his political career was not good. But anyways, okay, but the Whigs, now the Whigs were, they were pro-business and they were pro national improvement, like roads and all that kind of stuff. But they were both slavery people and anti-slavery people could belong to that party. Okay, now I don't know that there were any abolitionists that would buy the Whig talk, although maybe in 1844 there might have been, okay, before the sides really showed up. But Van Buren was Jackson's handpicked guy. Well, see, he cut no ice in Grant County, though. Harrison, hey, kind of like the hometown boy, right? Oh, William Henry was here, in 1812 and did his work. And then, okay, so in 1848, this is a little more obscure. It was Zachary Taylor was the Whig candidate. Okay, and then Franklin Pierce. I used to get kids because Franklin Pierce, we have a president named Franklin Pierce. Yeah, he was called a doughface, a doughface because he just sort of soft pedaled. He was pro-slavery. He was absolutely pro-slavery, but he kind of soft pedaled it, because he was from New Hampshire. But anyways, okay. Now, but Franklin Pierce carried Grant County with 47%. Okay. And Winfield Scott, the Whig, got 34. Scott was would later be a general in the Civil War. And he had fought in the War of 1812, and he was enormously fat. They said they took two guys to help him get up on his horse, or they had a little thing like the exit ramp on an airplane. They had steps so he could get up there. But having said that, he was a good general. Even though people made fun of him, he was pretty smart about that. And then now things really changed in 1856. Okay, and the winner in Grant County, not in the nation, was John C. Fremont. How's it go? Free soil, free men, and Fremont. That was the the thing that they chanted as they went up and down the street. And they did go up and down the street chanting. Up where I come from, they were big. This is the founding of the Republican Party, first presidential candidate. And where I come from, there's this town of Fremont, just north of Angola. And Big Eagle is their is there on their seal. Okay, Fremont, Cary Grant County with 53% of the vote. Second was Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan, oh boy, what can we say? He was the one that was president prior to Abe Lincoln, and he is the one. Although from Pennsylvania, he was a Southern sympathizer, and for example, he appointed Jefferson Davis to his cabinet. Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, went about emptying the armories and stuff, and I mean the setting in motion by 1859, a whole lot of stuff that's going to just make the secession movement a whole lot easier. And I think Douglas was another one that was called a doughface. Also because he was a large guy. I mean, boy, they were cruel back then. Okay, we are too. Okay, so that was Millard Fillmore, who's another president I know was on the tip of your tongues. Got no place. It was the Know Nothing Party, who wanted all foreigners to go back to their native land, which took a lot of gut. Well, it still does. Anyway, all right. So now what happens? All right, we know the lead up. We know that okay. So the South decides that things are intolerable. Hey, we're going to secede from the Union, and then there were some attempts to reconcile. But did not work. A lot of historians feel that the thing that sealed the deal of secession for the Southerners was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Okay. And it's interesting because Lincoln, at that particular time, he was against slavery. He always was against slavery. But he felt that he made a statement repeatedly over and over. Look, we've got to save the Union. Remember his statement about if we could keep slavery and save the Union, we should keep it. If we could save the Union by abolishing slavery, we should abolish it, which is kind of a tricky thing to say. Lincoln was a good politician. If you say, because he came to the position that you couldn't save the Union and have slavery. All right, which probably was his position all the way along. But the Southerners just, oh man, they went nuts. They thought he was a wild, radical person. And really, he wasn't. Now, he held very strong views. Okay. Well, anyways, he got 56% of the vote in Grant County. And that was going. Now, Douglas, who was the Democrat, Stephen Douglas, got 41%. So, anyways, okay. So Anderson, Major Anderson, and the whole deal in South Carolina, in Charleston, the firing on Fort Sumter, and Lincoln sent the relief ships to help relieve the place, and they were turned away. Okay, so once the South starts seceding from the Union, and war breaks out, Lincoln issues the call. All right, the call for troops. Okay, and here comes, finally we're at the Civil War, but okay. Some in the beginning days, okay, there were plenty of meetings in Marion, for the whole county. People were coming to town. Okay, so what are we going to do? Lincoln said he needed 30,000 troops for 1 month. Boy, was he wrong. But I mean, I think he knew it was going to take more. But look, that's all you could say. Could you say we need 1 million troops for 4 years? People say, man, you're crazy. No, we're not. It's like Roosevelt and the Lend-Lease. People had to work their way into it, even though they were. It's interesting in the Brandt and Fuller book, he's using an account by Edgar Goldthwait, okay, who was a local Marion man merchant. He also edited the newspaper, one of the newspapers then, which is no longer around, the Marion Democrat. I think the library has one copy, right? One issue, one copy of one issue. I mean, I think those were all burnt at some time. Okay. But anyways, he was writing, and he tackles this issue. He said, yes, it was it was slavery, um, the antipathy towards slavery, but it was coupled with the notion that a free person, a free white man, is not regarded with any sort of respectability in the South. And we're talking about their ancestors, the folks that came to uh, Grant County, the Quakers. They weren't highly regarded. They had experience in the South. They worked and were successful, and basically got driven out. Okay, and so they're saying, don't believe them. Even people that, and I'm sure there were a number of people probably were not as enlightened about African Americans as you know that has taken years to work its way through, and still isn't quite where it should. Well, it isn't where it should be, but anyways, so you had that, and you had those Knights of the Golden Circle, of course, but they got volunteers together. Now, two of the leaders, I mention names now because you're genealogists, some of these may be your relatives. Okay, David Shunk. Now we've heard of David Shunk, right? Shunk Street in Marion, which really is not a very great street to have named after. It's it's down there behind the Marion Armory, and it used to be kind of I guess it's all right now. But anyways, David Shunk and another guy who I really am interested in, O.H.P. Carey, Carey. Now, it's Oliver Hazard Perry Carey. I can see why he was always he went by OHP. Oliver Hazard Perry Carey. And both of them are interesting people. And they were involved in the Mexican American War of 1848. And there was a contingent of men who went to the Mexican American War in 1848. A lot of them will crop up as officers in these various companies and regiments that went from Grant County. Asbury Steele is one. There are several people, but the Mexican American War, from the perspective of the men that went from Marion, Indiana, was horrible. Now, of course, that war, they put out the call, the patriotic duty, and they formed a company, and they headed off to Mexico. They went down to New Orleans. They put them on a steamboat, a paddle wheel that was operated right off the shore, like inside of land, and went down to Corpus Christi, Texas, and promptly blew up and sunk and killed a guy and scalded a whole bunch of others. And then they got down to Mexico, and they came from Marion with wool uniforms, and they got off at, down there across from Brownsville, and then went into the interior of Mexico. And really, men were dying of heat. It's like today, like, what are we going to do? Okay. And by the way, like a number of names of like Mir, Peru, not Peru, Mir, what was it? Chile, Mexico. That's up in Rhonda's territory, isn't it, Rhonda? Some of these towns that have Mexico, a lot of them were named from these exotic places in Mexico. Well, it was also, by the way, they found out really quick, it was a slaveholders' war. What that was about was the South was wanting to secure the Southwest, what became the southwestern part of the United States, for slavery. Okay, they figured out it could work, because it was working in Texas. When they cut down the trees in East Texas, the piney woods, they just flattened them and then turned them into cotton plantations. And so, and the North, was moving out. Now there's a whole lot of contention over Kansas and Nebraska. And then remember, in 1849, gold in California. Now that whole thing leaps across the continent, because everything in between, like Colorado, Wyoming, I hate to say it, but Montana, I mean, you talk about wild and woolly. It only been like what, 40 years since Lewis and Clark, and it was,
Right.
really the Native Americans were very powerful. The Lakota out there, and the Comanches and the Shawnees, or not Shawnees, but the Comanches and the Apaches down south. And it was not, it was an equal, the question was still open, who was going to come out on top. Right. And so that was a problem. But the South said, if we can get that southern part done, or annexed, then we can run a railroad from New Orleans to Los Angeles. By the way, which they did after the war. It's called the Southern Pacific. Okay. And of course, the North is saying, but you see, if we get Kansas and Nebraska in the Union, we can run a road from Chicago to San Francisco, which they did. That was the Union Pacific. Then later on, it was the Northern. Oh, anyways. Okay. So they called the people to town. They said, look, we need you to sign up. And it said they were having big parades. Like some people from, I want to say, from Liberty Township. Now, this wasn't the Weaver folks, as far as I know, but I think it was just the other farmers. They brought a giant log. You know how they moved logs? They put wheeled carriages underneath each end of the log. Like you've probably seen this, they still do that. There was no middle support, it was the log. And it was this big giant log, and there were like dozens of people riding on top of the log. And it had to do something with, they stretch it, the rail splitter, and that sort of stuff. They had music, they had all kinds of stuff. And then they had the sign up. And it was at that time they had a guy showed up, they signed the thing, okay. And in 2 weeks they were loaded up on wagons. Now there's not a railroad connection at this time. So they were on Branson Street. It said they brought the wagons, and the bands and all the people came down there to see them off, and the guys clambered up into the wagons, and they took them by road. It must have been the route of where 9 US 9 or the State Highway 9 is, because that's a pretty straight shot. The railroad actually parallels it now, but they took it to Anderson, and then from Anderson, I think there was a train from Anderson to Indianapolis. Well, they got them down to Indianapolis, okay, and then off they were, okay. And in June, but every place the train stopped, I like this, they had a parade. In Jonesboro, it said they had a giant parade, and people marched around, and celebrated. And then in Fairmount, or not the train, but the wagons, they had a triumphal arch, like in Rome. They built it out of something, and everybody had to go under this triumphal arch. Now, the first part here is of the Civil War thing here. I guess I'm doing okay. Is this all right? Is this okay? Okay, nobody's turned it off yet, so we must be doing all right. Okay, so the first part is called the 30 Days War. Okay, and this has to do with the view of most people that it's going to be over in 30 days. The South, they'll just cave, and of course the Southerners believed that about the North too, because they felt that they did have a military tradition. That same aristocracy were like Lee, and a number of those subsequent Southern generals were part of that planter aristocracy, and they went to West Point, and they also had their the Citadel in Virginia, right? Or no, it's South Carolina. They had this whole military tradition going for them, and they thought the North were a bunch of sodbusters. I mean, what are they going to do? And they didn't reckon on Grant, who very definitely was a sodbuster. Okay, I mean his background. Anyways, okay, so in 23rd April 1861. Now this is right quick after the first shots were fired. Well, they mustered in Indianapolis, and Shunk was promoted to major. Now, this is of this volunteer group, okay? And the way it was structured was that the company elected their officers. Okay. Now the other thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure as genealogists you know this, that people went from the same community to the same company, or even to the same regiment. I wonder how many of these people had never been outside of Grant County. The younger ones, I'll bet you they hadn't. I mean, but I mean, you're going to ride a board road to Anderson for Pete's sake. I mean, you know. So, anyways, so the war became real very quickly. There was another guy I'm interested in. I just found when I was doing some research for this, a guy I ran into by the name of Jacob Wells, Wells. Jacob Wells. He was born and raised in Marion, and he was elected second lieutenant. More about him later. He's going to pop up later on. It's fascinating. The first lieutenant was John, I think it's Royce, Ruess. And I know I've known people in Marion by that name, or Russ, or maybe it's Russ. Anyways. Okay. Then they were off to Clarksburg, West Virginia. Now, does that sound familiar? The Battle of Rich Mountain? I know Rhonda, and you should know it too, Renee. Something significant. Now that was now when we say West Virginia, West Virginia wasn't a state until 1863. It was Virginia. And Lincoln's advisor said, the West Virginians don't like Virginia, because that's planter, we're farmers. And now they weren't wild about slavery either, about the abolition of slavery, okay? But they could handle it just to get even with the aristocracy. So they split the state off and created 3 more electors for Lincoln. They did that with Nevada too, okay? The state of Nevada Nevada became a state without the required population. But oh well, that's politics. All right. So, anyways, okay. So, the Battle of Rich Mountain. What's his name? John. Was it Anderson? Our guy of the window, John. The GAR window. In the library. In the
Adam.
John Adams. Right, John Adams. He said that was the one battle he was actually in. Okay. He was in the battle of let's see, right here it is. Okay, it was Rich Mountain. And the Union lost it. Okay. And now they were in for 30 days. So after June 19th, it was time to come back. So by July 24th, they were back in Indianapolis and they were mustered out of the army. Go home. It's over with. Well, by then, though, by July, they got the picture that this may be a bigger fight than we thought. Okay. So Goldthwait said that many re-enlisted then. Now, this time, however, you had to enlist for 3 years. This 30 days business was not. It was crazy. How you train somebody? Well, actually, you weren't trained very well. Oh, I need to mention that when American soldiers went off to that first call, that the county was supposed to issue them rifles, and county government being what it is and was, the only rifles they had was the rusty muskets left over from the Mexican War. So they issued those. I think when they got to Indianapolis, they wouldn't fire. They had to sit around and get them, somehow dredge up some new guns for them. But okay, so now those guys that had now some of them that had 30 days stayed, didn't go back. Okay, there's a expression. Have you ever heard it called "going to see the elephant"? That was a common saying amongst Civil War soldiers about, these people that were red hot to go to war. Let me at them. I'll go down there and I'll wipe out a whole company of Rebs. Well, it was horrible. and you had to, like in Richmond, you had to haul stuff up a mountain. Where's a mountain in Grant County? It's not like, wrestling the hogs or something. It was really, it was July. Okay. So it was bad and it was awful and it was terrible and it was, bloody and nasty. And they called that seeing the elephant. They said, if people go to see the elephant, if once you see it, you don't want to look again. All right. So some of them saw the elephant and said, I'm not going back. I'm staying home. Well, you've done your bit, right? All right. And then the group got sent to Missouri. There again, that's out of the frying pan and into the fire because, as you know, at the beginning of the Civil War, Missouri was a slave state, but they did not secede, largely because of their German population. There were a considerable number of German immigrants that had come over in the 1840s to Missouri and help, and St. Louis. They were city folks largely, and they had farms too. But there were also a number of white settlers, white European settlers, Scotch Irish settlers, like my own dear third great grandfather who went to Northwest Missouri, right across from Iowa. Iowa had not really been open yet. Kansas, you remember Bleeding Kansas? I mean, that was awful. And it was a conflict between pro and anti-slavery people. So that was sort of a hotbed, as was Arkansas. And if you've ever been to Arkansas, in a lot of places it's quite beautiful, but it's the Ozarks, and they were red hot slave owners, okay? And so they put up quite a resistance. Now, this first group, this was the 8th Indiana. Okay, it was the 8th Indiana, and it was the first regiment formed, okay, in the Civil War. And they participated in the siege of Vicksburg. Now, the siege of Vicksburg is central to Grant County's participation in the Civil War. Not all, but most of those units did time at Vicksburg. It's on the Mississippi River, and there's a bend in the river, and there's New Orleans, and there's Vicksburg, and there's St. Louis, were all major ports on the river for getting cotton, down to New Orleans and selling supplies, and also for moving slaves, quite frankly. And so Grant's plan, our old sodbuster Grant, he's a very, very slick guy. He decided that he could cut the South in half by taking Vicksburg down. Now, St. Louis was touchy, but it was still in Union hands, and with those German settlers, it wasn't going to go. The South could never reach that far, But Vicksburg was solidly, it's Vicksburg, Mississippi. Okay, and Mississippi is the heart of the South. It's also Jefferson Davis's home territory. His plantation was at Big Bend, which is not far from Vicksburg. All right, so the Indiana guys went down to Vicksburg. More about that in a little bit, but it was the fall of Vicksburg, by the way, in 1863, was considered to be like Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Okay, the Union's victories at both places. Now, and I'm not a military historian, but the ones I read say that those two victories really turned the war in favor of the Union. Now, it's still going to go on for 2 more years. Okay, it didn't end it necessarily, but it put in place a strategy that was going to be successful in the long run. So that's the 8th. Now, the public sentiment in Marion was overwhelming in support of the war. The ladies of Marion presented a flag, one for each company, at the front. Okay, when they would go to get on. Now, when they go to take the wagons to go down to Indianapolis, they'd sew their company flag. It would be like Company H, and present them in a very dramatic. They would go downtown to the old courthouse, which, as I understand, was on the north side of the square, where Halstead's old office is, and Brunt's was, and okay, that it was a brick courthouse, and they would march around and have speeches and present the flags and have prayers, and then go down to the wagons with the guys and head off. Now, the second group coming from Marion was the 12th Regiment. Now, these guys, I sort of misspoke. There was a possibility of 1 year of service. There was 30 days, 1 year, and 3 years. But practically speaking, the 1 years became 3. Okay, you get the picture. So, and some people did bow out after one, but usually those were people that were older, quite frankly, they were figured this out, that war is, especially that kind of war, is a younger man's game. And so if you were 40 and a businessman downtown, you might want to consider not doing it. Okay, but some did. Okay, now, oh, by the way, but that the companies gathered in front of the Spencer House, which is now the Willis Van Vendor place, the county annex. Okay, the 12th, now the 12th Regiment was formed with John Wallace was the colonel. Now, a couple of names, I mean, Wallace is kind of a major name in Marion, but William Lomax. Y'all know William Lomax, Dr. Lomax? Are you a relative of Dr. Lomax? Aha, she is, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I got something to tell you. My wife and I'm from Angola, like I said. My wife's from Marion, but there was a guy in our family her family that was a genealogist, and what he found out was that there were Dr. Lomax, Ayers, and another one called Cameron. They were Scots, and they were formally trained doctors, which was highly unusual for the time. I mean, most doctors studied under another doctor, sawbones, seriously, and then hung out his shingle, and the old doctor would give him his bag of stuff, and then off you'd go. These guys had gone to, I think, Lomax, I think it was Columbia or King's College, and someone went to King's College in New York, I know, but anyways, they all three were old Scots, and they knew their business. Lomax was appointed, obviously, the company surgeon, which was, have you ever seen those accounts of medicine in the Civil War? Oh my God. They wore butcher's vests, like the meat cutters, they were oilskin of some kind. And, they had, a lot of them wore top hats as a sign of their profession, and did not wash their hands. And they didn't wash their stuff. I think of poor old Clara Barton running around, they practically drove her out for telling them they got to wash their hands. But, you don't go from this patient to that patient with the same, but anyway. Okay, so Lomax was there. And another man whose name will crop up in Marion history, George W. Steele. And we know who George Steele was, okay? Interesting guy. He later is territorial governor of Oklahoma. He's the congressman that was credited with bringing home the bacon, and getting the military home. It was called National Military Home. By the way, I didn't know this. He also owned the land upon which it was built. He bought up all the land out there and said, "Where are we going to put this?" And he said, I know where we put it. We put it out there off of 38th Street. I don't know what it was called then, but probably something Pike, he was, but he did a lot of good things. They hated him in Oklahoma, by the way. It's a great story. He told them they had to have public schools, and they didn't want them. That was just something about Oklahoma. Anyways, okay, so and he was a lieutenant. And then, okay, and after they were sent out later they went out to the Army of the Shenandoah. Now, the guy that was Phil Sheridan's going to be in later going to be earned his fame in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. He's kind of like the General Sherman of the Shenandoah, riding up and down there, burning everything. And of course, he was fighting, Stonewall Jackson, and it was a bloody contest. But they were out there. Okay, so you got one group of Marion guys are there at Vicksburg and that siege, and then after they win the siege, they go into Mississippi, which was like going to the Philippines. It was much worse. And it was you were fighting these guys on home turf. I read something where the Southerners, the guys like from Virginia and Georgia and even some Mississippians didn't want to fight in Mississippi because it was it was deadly. I mean, other than the shooting and stuff because of cholera and all kinds of nasty stuff. So when Vicksburg fell, Texas was a Confederate state, right? It got cut off from the Union. And there were soldiers, some regiments from Texas that couldn't go back. Okay, there was no way they could fight their way back into Texas. Well, they weren't going to surrender. The Confederate, it was General Lee, I think. I'm not doing that for sure, but they said, Texans, we got a good idea. You can fight here in Mississippi. While we Mississippians, we're going to go further east. And they fought valiantly, but died like flies, as did, by the way, some of our guys from Indiana. I have a relative that was there from north of Fort Wayne, and going from north of Fort Wayne to fighting in Mississippi, was it Black River? It was terrible. Okay. So we have them in Mississippi. Now, I'm not going to go through all these. I just wanted to mention the big one, the big group from Grant County was the 34th, the 34th Infantry. Now, I mentioned to you that people entered the same companies. Well, it was because it was sort of like unit cohesion they talk about today. I mean, like the guys that went to Iraq and in Afghanistan and all this. You have to have something to meld these people together because they're going to have to take care of each other. Okay, in battle and out of battle. The Union Army did not provide food. You had to buy it. I mean, the soldier had to buy it or steal it. Okay. I mean, it was forage and they had these guys, they were called settlers. They would follow the troops in their wagons and they'd have canned beans and stuff like that. It was expensive, and you might get one egg or something like that, and so it was pretty miserable for these guys. Oh, I want to say the 34th though, it was the fact that these guys could share whatever they had with each other. Some guy didn't have something to eat, you gave him some of yours, and you knew them. And you also, if you had family members, you were in the same company as your family members. All right. And now, we found out some pretty tragic things in the First and Second World War about that, till they decided that can't happen. Because whole family, whole generation of a family, all the brothers, and they had large families. A family might lose 3 brothers, all in one day, all in one place. Well, the idea was, I know it's hard to fathom, but they figured you'd fight harder. Okay, because you were not just fighting for yourself. Your brother was right there. Or sometimes your father. There was cases of that too. Okay. So this 34th was really an amazing regiment, and because there were a large number. I don't know the exact number. They just said they were from all parts of the county. So you had a guys from Van Buren, guys from, Fairmount, that whole thing. Now, and they were 3-year men, and they even brought their own regimental band from Marion. And I do recommend Terrell's Report of the Adjutant General. Okay, the library has a complete set. It takes up almost a whole shelf. I don't know how many volumes it is, but it's a whole slew of them. I got a secret for you. It's available online at Internet Archive. Now, I find it very hard to use, but that may be me. Okay, because hunting thing, it's a different story. What they've done is the print's small. Okay, so you got to make it big, and then the finder, since you're looking for names, it doesn't do names very well. So if you're looking for Lewis Lomax, even though that would probably be, or not Lewis Lomax, but William Lomax, that's not a really common name. But what it will do is it'll get stuck on William, and it's like what's 30 times 800? It's like 10,000 pages. Okay, and you get all these things, and by the time you open 5 of them, you spent all afternoon. I would suggest, and they're available at libraries. I mean, like some of the big libraries, I found it at also at the University of California, and I mean, not personally, but I mean, I found it online. I did do some online stuff, but it's like I say, it's kind of tricky because the minute you think you found something, you haven't. All right, and you can't highlight. It's like the Google stuff. The Google library, you can't highlight it and cut and paste. It means you got to take notes. Okay. So what I do is I've got one computer by this computer that you see me on. I go like this. I'm looking like this. Okay. But I've got to look to type. So I'm dizzy. All right. So anyway, but the 34th, I have, by the way, another presentation for down the road. I get a little more specific. I take up some things about the 34th. They were in on the capture of Vicksburg, and David Shunk was right there at the front. And when they knew that Vicksburg was going to fall, okay, this was the big assault and Vicksburg was setting up on cliffs, bluffs overlooking the river. They were going to go right in there, and Lew Wallace and Shunk and those guys requested that the 34th Regiment be the vanguard, that they'll be the first one into Vicksburg. Now, I think if I were a soldier, you'd have mixed emotions because that's the most deadliest position to be in. It's like if you remember the movie Glory, about the African American soldiers in South Carolina, what they would do, there were a lot of Southern, I don't want to say Southern sympathizers, but Southerners who were Unionists, who had officers' positions in the Union Army, and they were loyal. But the problem was they hated the freed black soldier, just hated them. And what they would do is put them right out on the point every time. They say, okay, we'll send the 28th Indiana in there first. They're going to take the brunt of the attack, and then we'll send the rest of the guys in. Okay. And it meant sure death, really, for a lot of them. And they knew it. But I remember reading accounts where the thought was in the black ranks about if we don't win this war, we have nothing to live for. It's all or nothing. The South the Confederates have got to be defeated. Slave owners have got to lose for us to be free. So, but the Indiana guys, there's sort of a story here that the Indiana guys that were at in the Mexican War, the other the other American soldiers made fun of them and said they were cowards, because what happened, and it was, I think, the Battle of Buena Vista, in Mexico, their wagons and stuff broke down and they were late. They were supposed to come in at a certain point, in the attack to, I don't know, hold up the middle, like they were going to do one of those enveloping things, I can't remember exactly what the deal was, something like that. Okay, but they turned around and the Hoosiers weren't there. These were some Marion guys too. I mean, it wasn't the 34th, but Indiana, larger group. And there was all kinds of recriminations, because when the Hoosiers got there, the battle had been won, and the other soldiers, other American soldiers, booed them and said, "Oh, you're cowards, you're no good," and they kept writing them about this, and said, "Hoosiers are cowards. Hoosiers are cowards." Well, that was, according to some historians, that is why Shunk wanted those soldiers to go in first to show the rest of those soldiers that they weren't cowards, that they're just as brave as they were. And when they got into Vicksburg, I mean, they laid waste to that town. Most of the people had left. Okay, they fled out the other way. But I understand that for years after the war, that a number of people, Indiana soldiers, families, had on their wall a little framed, not a picture, a little frame with a piece of flocked wallpaper in it. What that was, when those soldiers got into those aristocrats' houses, they ripped everything down, and they took pieces of the wallpaper and put them in their letters back home to their sweethearts and their parents, and say, this is a piece of Vicksburg that you can tell your friends that people from Indiana are not cowards. We're just as brave. I mean, now it may be apocrypha, okay, but it's a great story. I love it. Okay, so take it. I tell people, hey, who knows? It might be true. Okay, now, but that they are very important. Now, and I need one more thing. And you may have, I mean, if you have relatives from Grant County in the Civil War, by the way, I don't mean to skip on Lomax. That's a story in itself. I'll save it for another. You know about his wife, Sarah, I believe, his first wife. She went with him. A sad story. We'll get to it next time. Okay. Oh, anyways, and that one I know is true. All right. That was they were the 34th after Vicksburg were sent to Texas. Okay, they went out to Texas. Now they stayed in Texas, and there weren't a lot of battles in Texas, but the last battle of the Civil War at Palmetto Ranch, down there right on the Rio Grande River, the deal was this, that the Confederates still had an army. They didn't know the war was over. The war was over. And they didn't know, because how would you know, right? I mean, all the telegraph lines were down and all that stuff. And there was a pitched battle. It was, by the way, the general commanding those guys was our old friend Lew Wallace. Another aside, Lew Wallace's uncle lived in Marion. Okay, David Wallace and company, and Lew's cousin was in the 34th. That's a Wallace. Okay, there were Wallaces in the Marion regiment. Okay, but at Palmetto Ranch, they lost. Okay, and it was a very ignominious defeat. However, the Confederates figured out later that they had actually lost the war. They surrendered, and they got back to Marion in 1866. So they did some occupation stuff. Also, Grant County's African American soldiers, the 28th Infantry U.S. Colored Troops, Thomas Gulliford from Weaver and his buddies, they were down there too. Okay, so they weren't at Palmetto Ridge. They stayed in, I think they stayed in Brownsville, but they were down there. And some of those guys, not Gulliford, but some of the other ones, they stayed on after the war and kept in the army and became Buffalo Soldiers. You've probably heard that. They were involved in the Indian Wars. Okay, all righty. There was one group, the 89th Regiment, was mostly from Jonesboro and its surroundings, okay, from the southern part of the county. So if you have relatives there, or from that area of the county, and they were in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Now, I get the picture that some of these were more involved in fighting than others. Some of them were doing, like when the army would secure an area, they were the ones that moved in and more or less occupied the area. Okay, they were sort of standing posts or supply or guarding railroads and that kind of stuff. There was a cavalry unit, the 5th Cavalry. This is an interesting bunch of guys. They fought at the siege of Atlanta, which, and I guess it was, I want to say, I've had said Vicksburg, the fall of Atlanta, and Gettysburg were the 3 ones that put the sort of the cap on it, even though the war lasted long. I used to kid a friend of mine from Georgia, and my ancestor from northern Indiana was at Atlanta, and I said, they said, what do you think of Atlanta? I said, well, it got better after the Hoosiers burned it down. That was Sherman's army, and they weren't the only ones there, but they certainly were running around with a torch. Okay, and this the thing got me, was that particular group then were sent back up to Tennessee and then to southern Ohio to guard against southern incursions. One of my favorite, again, this was told about General Grant, who engineered that thing, and said Bragg, the Confederate General Bragg, after Atlanta fell, he was going around saying, we're going to get Atlanta back. Don't worry about it. We'll come back. Well, he didn't know it had been burnt to a charcoal, and he said, we will drive them back upon the snows of the North. Well, like Napoleon, the Russians did to Napoleon, right? That was what he's alluding to. And when Grant was told that, Grant turned to the guy and said, well, where in the hell are they going to get the snow? I love that. He was a wit. Anyway, I've used that on occasion. Okay, now 101st was at Lookout Mountain in Chickamauga. Lookout Mountain was horrible. Okay, that was, Grant sent them right up the mountain. His troops up the mountain, and this was the 101st and a lot of guys from Grant County there. They had to drag the cannons up there. I mean, it stopped. They were fighting on an incline. And this is, by the way, one of the things that contributed to Grant's reputation, sometimes called by his own troop as Butcher Grant, because what they had to do was go over the top of the fallen guys that were there in front of them. Well, those guns, they couldn't stop. They had to keep going. And the Southerners really walloped them on that one. And also at Shiloh, which you've probably heard of, which was another bloody mess. Percy Nussbaum. Have you ever heard that name? A Marion. He was in charge of the Marion Conservatory of Music. Okay, the one that Cole Porter studied at, and our friend the harpist, she's still on the wall. Dilling. Mildred Dilling on later. I mean, later. But Percy was like 14, and he was, they had boys in the military as bugle boys and flag, not the big flags, but regimental flag and messengers and all that kind of stuff. And at Shiloh, it was such I think there were 24,000 men died on both sides. It was just awful. And the first day the Union got walloped, and the deal was this. This is ironic. Guess who was late to the battle, or at least was accused of being late to the battle? Lew Wallace. He was bringing wagons around. He captured a whole bunch of wagons, and he brought them up to Grant after the defeat. And he didn't know this was a defeat. And Grant said, "Where were you?" And he said, "I captured all these wagons." And Grant said, "These wagons will do us no good whatsoever." And Grant had I recommend. I'm not a military historian, but Grant's memoirs are good. They are excellent. I recommend that you read them because it's not full of military jargon. He doesn't write in jargon at all. It's like straightforward, and he tells the story well. And he takes, if he screwed up in something, he'll say this was one of the worst decisions that I could possibly, and I still have to live with the notion that I caused the death of, not only the death of the victors, but the incredible amount of killing that was done in that. And he takes part, but he's well, anyways, I recommend. Okay, so all right, and I'll just jump down here. There's another thing that I wanted to mention. The interesting, you may have had a relative in the Indiana Legion. I don't know if you've heard of the Indiana Legion. It was, do you remember that old show that used to be on PBS called Dad's Army? About World War II in England, where the dads, the old guys, was like the home guard, and they gave them old uniforms and old blunderbusses and stuff. And this was, and they were seriously, they were told that they may have to call upon the defense of the country if the Germans had won at Dunkirk, they would have been in England. And the army would have been captured. It was almost captured at Dunkirk, most of it. And they trained these guys, like to, make bombs to hide in sewers and stuff. I mean, it was a home defense thing. Well, that's what the Indiana Legion. It wasn't quite that developed, but it was to keep order on the home front because there were a number of Southern sympathizers. There was a Southern raid on Madison and that area down there. From Kentucky. I forget his name. What was the raider's name? What?
Was it Brown?
Who?
Was it Brown?
Not Brown.
Okay.
Well, anyways, and they had. It's interesting because they had Quantrell. Well, no, Quantrell was in Missouri.
Oh, Missouri. Okay.
Okay, but the guy was like Quantrell. They were actually sort of like, yeah, they were Southern Army, but they were basically bandits. They were, well, anyways. Okay, so
Was it came up from Kentucky and like thrashed and burned through Jennings County?
Right.
That guy?
Yeah.
Oh,
I was just talking. Morgan. Yeah.
Morgan, yeah.
The James brothers got their training in nastiness in the Raiders in Missouri. Quantrell, he was out in Missouri, and so was the. Oh well, okay. Just a couple of things. I know we're over. Okay, I guess there's a Zoom. Turn this off now.
Yeah, it will be soon. Yeah.
Okay, the draft. The draft was a big issue. It always is. Americans, the draft, I grew up in the Vietnam generation, so I know something about the draft. The first draft was in 1862. In Grant County, there were 2,078 men subject to the draft. There were 786 then in service. The volunteer list had 93 names on it. Now, the actual number was a formula that they derived at. And so when they worked out the number in service versus the number they needed, the difference was made in enlistments. So we've got like here 800 and some people that were in service or on the volunteer list. They needed 2,078. The difference was made up by enlistments. Okay, so they would have gotten 1,200 enlistments by October 6th, 1862. Now, I suggest those are but because they're 30 days, and you didn't know what you were getting into. You hadn't seen the elephant yet. Nobody had seen the elephant, really, basically. Okay, the second draft was October 17th, 1863, and the Grant County quota, see, your quota was that difference. Okay, you had to make up that difference, was 162, which is was not many. They were able to meet that without the draft. Right now, it's interesting. Lincoln moved that date back. See, oh no, that's another way. Okay, so the third draft was in 1864, July. Grant County quota was 840, and they had, let's say, there were 512 new volunteers, and 85 vets. They had to draft 247 people. They had draft right in Jonesboro then. The Golden Circle guys came to town and were raising Cain, and of course there was an army company there, and I think they beat him up and sent him back to Jonesboro, or not Jonesboro, but Matthews. Okay, which they belonged down there. Okay, the grand total of men credited to Grant County. Now, this is official by Terrell, who's working for the adjutant general. I mean, they're talking about this is how pensions were figured out. Okay, because if you start on your own, if you have, I mean, some of you may have you done genealogical stuff with Civil War guys? You know, they re-enlisted, they were in different units, you know, and I think the only way to settle some of that is either go through the whole of Terrell or get their pension records. You know, usually their pension records have their, you know, their reassignments. Okay. The grand total was 2,405 men. And those are distinctive enlistments. Those are not counting, you know, a repetition where they might have re-enlisted. Okay. Now, the total population of Grant County at that time was 11,000. Well, you know, the rule of thumb I understand in military circles is that a nation can only realistically, in terms of what size of army can they support. And I think the formula is 20%. Whatever 20% of your population is, this is a good test of how many, now we're talking about soldiers at the front, okay? Grant County had that. So what it's telling us that they really did support it. Another one I'll say for another time, because the 28th Indiana U.S. Colored Troops is mentioned in Terrell at the very back. Okay, and in Goldthwait's article in the History of Grant County, not mentioned at all, not one word. Okay, that's 1886. So it to me it tells you a lot about. Well, there was I think in the must have been in the maybe 1890s, you know, when the GAR was having a big convention or something in Marion, and they printed a list of Grant County veterans. They left all the black people off, the black guys. You know, I mean, those guys, well, we'll talk later. They were at the Battle of the Crater. All right, I guess that's it for tonight. Are there any questions? I hope I provided you with something to chew on here. Oh, about that Watson, just a second, or Wells, Jacob Wells. I first saw his name when I found a list of officers of the 28th Indiana U.S. Colored Troops, and he was a captain. Now, he was white. Now, I think we all know, or should know, that the officers of these colored units were all white. The captains and colonels and all that, they were all white. Okay. And, you know, if you watch Glory, remember the guy that was their captain was white. And I thought, who was Jacob Wells? I didn't have time. I was going to come up and see you guys. I did see you guys, but other stuff intervened. And I found out he was a kind of a big deal. And he was chairman of the Republican Party, like about the time the party got started, like in Lincoln's, you know, I think first campaign. And he was, after the war, he was appointed postmaster of Marion. He did a stint as postmaster. But also, I found this cool thing I'm looking at. He didn't show up for duty after he was appointed captain. I don't know whether he had got cold feet or just decided, I don't know what. He didn't show up. And Shunk, General Shunk, who was down in Mississippi, got the Indianapolis police to find him, and they got him and put him on a train and sent him down to Mississippi. Oh no, they didn't send him to Mississippi. They sent him to the 28th U.S. Colored Troops, which were shipping out for the James Peninsula out east. So there's a story there. Something happened, but
Yeah, we look forward to hearing it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we may not, that's the trouble, with these stories, you find just enough to be really excited and not enough to answer any questions. But anyways, that's it.
So anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah.
Yes, Sarah?
You know, I can, it's obvious you've done so much research and you have so much anecdotal information. And I was wondering if you could give us those references. I know you talked about, I have a history of Grant County someplace, and but you mentioned the one, the author that you preferred, and
Oh, General Grant?
Winston,
no,
Brent Fuller.
Brett Fuller.
Oh, Brandon Fuller. Yeah. Now, Brandon Fuller is they were a commercial outfit that printed county histories. They did them for counties all over the United States. And of course, it's formulaic. They use the same sort of, now not the same content, but the structure, the organization. But they were professionally done, and I think their attention to detail was better. I also used that souvenir copy of that 1840, or not 1840, but that big atlas.
1877.
1877 atlas, because it takes it back, I mean, in detail, like the maps and all that sort of stuff. But I really leaned heavily on Terrell. Okay. And even though my eyes crossed before tonight's presentation, you see Terrell, you're going, oh my gosh, teeny weeny little print. And it's like each book is, I think, 30 books. I think they're about 800 pages long, but they've got a table of contents. That's good. And I used the internet, which that geographic atlas of American elections is great, because you can hone in on Grant County. So you can find out how they voted. Now, it doesn't go by precinct, obviously, but you can call up like Miami County and Wabash County and take a look about the whole, get a picture of the whole area. Plus, I love maps. Oh God, I just love maps, and especially these. I think internet is good on maps generally, because if you can play with them and actually get that. But I did use Goldthwait. Now, Goldthwait's stuff, I don't think any of his stuff's in print, actually. I mean, he continued to write. He was a buddy of Edgar Baldwin. Edgar Baldwin, The Making of a Township. He was a Fairmount guy. He was the publisher of Fairmount News. Yeah. And his stuff on, especially Fairmount being, for the time, overwhelmingly Quaker. He was a Quaker. The Baldwin family, was really interesting people. And the library has letters and stuff. Lydia Baldwin's, I know you have her autobiography, but it's more of a collection of letters, but it's great. And then the biographical dictionary of Grant County, the one that comes with Brandon Fuller, and the one that comes with Whitson, actually, I think are pretty good, because they've got these really great lithographic plates of the people that they were talking about. Although it was, like if it was a Civil War guy, it's a picture of what he looked like in 1916. So, the blush of youth is over with. But that helps. And then it's as I understand it, in both cases, to get in the biographical dictionary, you had to pay. Okay. Because these were both, they were interested in making a buck on these things, and they were major tomes. You had to, books were sold by, the authors hawked their books, like they weren't printed yet. You paid for the book, and then when the book got published, you got a copy of the book. Mark Twain did that. General Grant did it. That's how General Grant survived as long as he did. He had terrible cancer of the face, and it was Mark Twain that edited his book. That's probably why his autobiography is so good. It's not. I mean, it's not a laugh a minute, because Grant was not a jokester. I mean, he was very straightforward, But yeah, I like to use primary sources whenever. Although I have nothing against secondary sources. There's some really good stuff out there, but I recommend, for if you're doing research. Now, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your stuff. You're all big time in the genealogical world. I mean, I use I have to start with something like that county history that points me. Okay, listen, we need to take a look at the 34th. Okay, and I know from that Asbury Steele was in it. Now, Asbury Steele, I need to talk to you guys, because I'm not sure what the relationship between Asbury Steele and George was. Asbury Steele was a colonel in that 34th, and when he came back to Marion was about, I think, 700 or 800 people. It wasn't very big. Okay. And when it got status of a town, it went from a village to a town. And in effect, Asbury Steele was the first mayor of Marion. But there are unconfirmed stories, as you guys know, about genealogy stuff, that he may have had, may have had like PTSD or some long-lasting psychological thing going on. Because now he lived a long time, but the story goes, unconfirmed, that he committed suicide, which was highly unusual back then. But it wouldn't be if he was in the Mexican War and it was that bad, and then he was in the Civil War. I mean, I don't know how the man, that's a lot of violence to. But we know guys. I know guys that did like 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan or Iraq, and some people can, they can make adjustments, or at least maybe hide their adjustments. But I just wonder about him. It's the personalities start popping up at you, even in a dry statistical report. But I like to start with that.
Any other questions, or?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, super good there. Anybody else have any questions? Going all night.
I'll get together a bibliography for you. But it's a lot of what I just said.
Okay. Well, we appreciate it, Bill. We'll hopefully get to go in and see you there in October with the Historical Society. And Sarah out in Montana won't be able to do that, but we'll have you do another Zoom after that and get the second part of the story here for Civil War in Grant County. I know we ran a little long, but thanks, Bill, and thanks everybody for coming. Everybody have a great night. We'll have this up on YouTube in a week or so. So if you want to look there, you can see it there. So okay, everybody. Good night.
Good night.